from the Signature Bank Studios.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Coleman Hughes, friend of the show, a very sharp young guy, wrote the book, The End of Racial Politics. We had him on the show to discuss. I also did a podcast with him on that topic, if you want to check that out online. Very, very smart guy. Young guy, too, really. I mean, he sort of started making a name for himself when he was still an undergrad at Columbia. And very thoughtful, good writer. He was on a panel recently talking about DEI, and I thought this was a good riff he went on. University of Michigan, which we've talked about, which really established one of the most aggressive DEI bureaucracies at the collegiate level, and that's saying something. A lot of competition in that space. The parable of the snake Coleman Hughes used in order to illustrate his point about what these DEI bureaucracies actually produce.
I mean, look what happened at University of Michigan. So University of Michigan, unique, not unique, but special among state universities, went all in on DEI and multiplied its DEI hires by something like 10. They had over 200 DEI officials and made a specific point when Chris Rufo and Robbie Starbuck and others launched a very successful campaign against DEI in the media. They said, no, we're doubling down and tripling down. New York Times did an intensive investigation of what has been the result of that doubling and tripling down. And the result is best described by an old parable I heard from when the British ruled India, which was that they were having a problem with a particular kind of snake. You may have heard this. And so they decided to give a cash reward for every person who brought in a dead snake, thinking that 2 + 2 = 4, all the dead snakes will be gone. Turns out, if you give a cash reward for dead snakes, people will breed snakes and kill them and start snake farms. And it turns out that there were way more snakes at the end of this dumb program than there were at the beginning. That's kind of like what DEI bureaucracies are, right? You think, there's some racial discomfort, there's some microaggressions, there's occasionally some real racism on campus. Let's double our DEI department, they'll fix it. Well, it turns out, no, they just solicit problems that would not have been there otherwise. The thing that, when you might have been a college freshman, it was like an interesting, uncomfortable conversation with your roommate of a different race than you, where you both grew. That now gets reported to a DEI bureaucrat as a microaggression because they asked where you're from. So everything that seems like it's tamping down the problem is actually exacerbating it. And that's what happened at University of Michigan. And they've been forced to admit that really reluctantly because it's become so obvious, even for an organization that doubled and tripled down on its investment in DEI.
Yeah, and New York Times actually did a piece on it, too, which made it impossible for Michigan to not essentially concede the point that Coleman Hughes described. For more on this and a couple of other matters, pleased to be joined again by Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thanks for joining us again.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be with you, to spar again.
Yes, the DEI. Now, you've recently wrote about DEI, a slightly different angle of talking a bit more about Title IX, so based on sex and also age discrimination, which I want to get to. But let's get to it straight away. I mean, you can riff off of what Coleman Hughes had to say about DEI focusing on race, but I guess this would be applicable to the issues that you take up as well.
Yeah, look, what I was talking about is something that was introduced with huge aplomb about 50 years ago, 45 years ago, on the question of how it is that we deal with athletics in universities on the one hand, sex discrimination, and then with mandatory retirement of faculty, which came up somewhat later. And both of these programs I regard are completely destructive to the way in which a university ought to work. There is naturally a certain kind of asymmetry in sports between males and females, which has to be observed. Football is a huge drainer of revenue for just about everybody. And so what happens is you have to keep those teams alive, and then they subsidize the rest of the university. If you have a rule which says you're trying to get proportionate numbers of males and females into athletics, if you're going to do the football game, what you have to do is to wipe out minor sports everywhere else. And so you go to a place like University of Illinois or UCLA, they don't have a male swimming team. 300 wrestling teams have been recommissioned over the last 50 years and so forth, all to keep those numbers crazy. There are lots of stories where the men athletes pay the women to start a softball team so they could start a baseball team. And what happens is you just have to get rid of those kinds of times. Back in the early 1960s, 1970s, there was certainly a lag in women's sports, but the demands have become very much stronger. By the time the statutes were passed, most universities had made real internal accommodations because they respond to the pressures of their students. If you look at the situation today, it's exactly the opposite. We no longer have a majority of male students. We have a very strong majority of female students, 59 to 60%. If you try to keep that proportionality, you're just going to have to shut down male teams right and left, which is one reason why it is that males are going to be more reluctant to enroll in these kinds of universities. You get rid of this statute, you get rid of a huge bureaucracy like the DEI bureaucracy. What you do is you will find more male students coming in. The women who want sports programs can certainly speak to female administrators and male administrators in their own home. And what happens is by taking the government monkey off of everybody's back, what you will do is you'll have a less left-leaning kind of situation, which is what happens, and you'll have a much more open discourse on campus. One of the consequences of deciding to have these huge sex preferences in these programs is really quite simple and quite appalling. If you start speaking out against them, then it turns out that you're basically putting yourself into real hot water. And so I've known coaches who've been told, you may do what you want, but you can't do it on campus, because the moment you speak against Title IX and its rulings with respect to sex, you're basically violating university policy, and we're going to have to really clamp down upon you. If you wanted to get rid of all of that stuff, you lighten the burdens on universities from external situations, you free the faculties to being a little bit more conservative than they would otherwise be, you'll increase male participation, and probably won't reduce female participation. But even if you did, you have to be aware of what the trade-off is. Right now, if you try to get another man in there, it's going to be crazy. And what happens is, if you were to simply cut out some of the subsidies that are given to women, you may lose one woman athlete and gain 30 male athletes with the same amount of dollars. And if every student counts for one, the thought that you're improving economic educational opportunities for men and women when you make it vastly harder for non-football players to become sports, it's exactly what you heard about DEI. You're doing one thing and you're getting exactly the opposite result from what you want.
Right.
And this is done by a policy. So just get rid of it.
Well, so right. I mean, so Title IX is basically what you're suggesting is like some of these proposed racial spoil system. It's you basically have become what you railed against. It's just a different beneficiary and a different victim.
Yeah. It's exactly what it is, and it's so unnecessary. This thing was all done. The original purpose of Title IX, nobody's going to fight it today. It's irrelevant. You really want to say that you don't allow women to be chemistry majors at a university? That was the sort of thing that you actually faced back in the 1950s. It was rapidly crumbling at the time, and nobody cares if you say all programs and academics have to be open to students of both sexes. But the athlete stuff came through a series of letters. It was one of the most litigated and argued questions ever. Probably 10,000 letters or more were submitted on that question. And in the Carter administration, they came out with exactly a mad ruling which says the underrepresented sex always has to get all sorts of advantages until you get to parity. Well, parity is not what you're going to see in an unregulated market. There'll be more women in dance classes and more men in athletic classes. Let them sort voluntarily. And it's just a totally artificial assumption to assume that they're going to break exactly the same way. And just as it's a crazy assumption to assume that if you're talking about naval architecture, you're going to get as many female applicants as you get male applicants. In fact, the ratio is something like 97-3. You go into nursing, there are many more men going into it, which is just great. But it's certainly a profession which is dominantly female. Look at social work, it's the same thing. Universities essentially are highly sex specialized when it comes to their educational program, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. What we're trying to do is to satisfy the demands of the students. What we're not trying to do is satisfy the demands of certain administrators for kind of sex parity in a situation where that absolutely is at utter variance with the preferences that everybody has. And so you just got to get rid of this stuff and open it. And what Trump can say is, you think I'm really being hard on you and I want to tax your endowment or whatever? Here's something I'm giving you which is going to make your life more free. And there'll be some university that says, we want to remain in bondage because we think all of the stuff having to do with sex identity is something we have to preserve. It's a crazy value and it ought to go.
Well, I wanted to ask you quickly about Governor Janet Mills from Maine. I mean, President Trump met with governors from all the states, and he confronted her. I signed a federal executive order banning men or boys from playing girls' sports, and she defied it. And she said, well, we'll see you in court. And he's like, yeah, well, we'll see you in court. So what's going to happen when they go to court?
Well, he'll win. Look, I mean, that's another illustration. Basically allowing one man to enter a female swimming meet distorts it for everybody else. So women can't win women contests. I think it's 100% right. There's a very simple rule. You cannot declare yourself to be a woman and participate in female events. You have to undergo sexual reassignment in order to be able to do so, at which point you're not going to be any better than the other women whom you're fighting against. Now, I think Trump goes overboard when he takes after transgenders in the military. I think perfectly important for everybody to be there. And I'll stress something else. I 100% support him and extensively on it, that we do not want to have various kinds of hormonal treatments or operations on minors for sex change operations. But that's the minors that you're worried about. If somebody has decided to do them on themselves when there's an adult, nobody objects to it. And I can't see any reason why you'd want to keep these people out of the military. So it's a typical kind of Trump forte. He sees something right and then he does something stupid. You don't want to do that. What you do is focus on the abuse and get rid of it. And he's absolutely right about the University of Pennsylvania making a hero's welcome to men who win women's meets. And the women I know are all in favor of that. So it's another case of Title IX. Everybody's supposed to be equal. So what you do is you give this one preference, and then hundreds of women are cheated out of any opportunities to win various kinds of medals in that competition. Separate but equal has always been the proper norm in most sports. There are exceptions. In equestrianism, it's best I can tell, male and female riders compete on equal terms, and so there's no real selection. You want to do that in soccer? You get yourself a 100-0 game if you basically put a women's team against a male team. I mean, the differences are just enormous, and one has to respect that.
I want to get to the age discrimination piece too, because it's sort of it folds in tenure, and your targeting of age discrimination protections in academia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I mean, this is something very simple. If you looked at every university that was well run, without exception, everybody believes that there ought to be age caps and so forth, because there are many people who decline in effectiveness and are getting higher salaries. And somebody said, well, there's some people at the peak of their production. And so they are, but there's an aftermarket. And what happens in that market is people who are still productive get lots of offers to do lots of things. I'm almost 82, and it's not as though the age discrimination law protects me. What you have to do is keep on writing, and people will come to you. They won't give me a 10-year contract, but we'll work with us for a year or two or what it is. So the market works perfectly well in these areas. Once you put this thing into place, what happens is you completely change the dynamic of a faculty. You've got new disciplines that are arising. You've got old people who can't teach them. You want to hire 2 new faculty members. You could do so if one person was forced to retire, because that's what the wage differential was. If you want to get governance of people who are more forward-looking, you certainly don't want your committees dominated by people who are over 70. The prime ages in universities are 30s, 40s, and 50s, and that's where you want the core of your governance to come from. So why it is that you would protect these senior people and give them vested rights, at the same time the younger people who come to the faculty also get chairs. Their chairs are folding chairs. They get short-term contracts. They don't get tenure-track position. They're constantly put in things. And what happens is you create a gerontocracy, which isn't worth having. What you have to do is to repeal that statute. Now, how do we know that it's inefficient? Every university that's forced to keep people on immediately tries to find out ways to buy them off. And they do. You give a fixed contract, and if you leave at 65, you may get twice your annual salary just to go. People aren't paying you that money because they're efficient. They want you to leave. But what happens is all the able people take the money because they'll get other jobs, and the less able people, they keep their position, and they ruin the average faculty. So this is the kind of thing which has all these unintended reverse consequences. When this came up back in the late 1980s, I was very active on this thing. I wrote letter after letter telling people that they should never do something so stupid for tenured faculty, indeed, in anywhere in life. What they did is they gave businesses an exemption so they can also force their senior membership to retire. They didn't do it for academics under these circumstances. And now if you're trying to trade it, you're going to have to face another union problem. The American Association of University Professors is a union shop. And they like keeping their older people around because, as is the case with all unions, seniority is an enormously influenced situation. The top people who are the least productive have the greatest control over the operation in question. You're going to probably need legislation in order to do this, but essentially, age discrimination is really difficult because there's no way you conduct those rules. You fire somebody over 66, whatever the age is, you're finished, and everybody knows that. And so the statute's enforced, and this is the world we have. Every sober institution understands the importance of circulating through mandatory retirement, particularly if you have tenure. The only people who don't understand is the government. We're forcing everybody to do what everybody knows is unwise. And when this was put forward, one of my friends told me he was pushing this thing. He said, Richard, why are you worried about this? It's only in the great universities that this is going to have an adverse effect. I said, is this an argument for or against the situation? And any university that wants to extend employment, be my guest. I think it's quite unwise as a faculty matter to force retirement at 65. People now at 65 are as productive as people 100 years ago were at 50 or 45. So extend it a little bit if you want, but let it be done on a decentralized basis. The federal government has no business micromanaging universities. And again, if you then ask Mr. Trump, if you get rid of this, the cost of running a university go way down, and that means you could lower tuition and increase efficiency. The regulation of the way in which these universities operate has become, to my mind, something of a national scandal. And the moment you protect these kinds of folks, the power that they wield is not going to be to improve the university. It's basically to protect their own sinecures. I think all of us should be put on our own, and I can tell you, I never cared about this. And I wasn't covered by it. But the moment I hit 65, I said to myself, I don't want the protection of this. I want to get myself another job. The only way to do it is to continue to work. And I was lucky enough to be able to do so. And as far as I'm concerned, it's still the correct way to do it institutionally. And the market will adopt to people who are let go. And anybody who continues to have marketable skills after the mandatory retirement age will be able to find somebody in the market who is willing to hire it.
Well, we're happy you're still working, too. Professor Richard Epstein, James Parker Hall, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of Law and Senior Lecturer at the University of Chicago. Professor Epstein, thank you.
It's always been a pleasure. Take care and goodbye, Amy.
Bye. Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
You never want to miss one of life's most important moments. A graduation, a birthday, a first communion, a wedding. When these moments happen, you want to make sure to capture them so that you and your loved ones can remember them for years to come. For over 30 years, families have relied on Tom Kaloran Photography to capture important life moments. This locally owned family business can provide the solution